some people like to argue we can coexist with parasites. I just don't. I see the inflammation. I see the gut barrier function. We see the nutrient and malabsorption indicators. We see the symptoms, depression, anxiety, fatigue, weight gain, etc. And so I don't believe that you should leave these things alone. If I find them on a test, I'm going to take care of them.
Welcome to the Less Stressed Life podcast. This is your host, Krista Bigler, private practice integrative nutritionist, helping people across the U.S. reverse digestive issues, eczema, and autoimmunity via phone and video consult. To learn more, visit lessstressednutrition.com. Now, on to the show. Okay, so today on The Less Stressed Life, we have Evan Brand, a fellow podcaster. He's the podcast host of, it's actually called The Evan Brand Show, right, Evan?
That's right.
All right, cool. So he's a certified functional medicine practitioner and nutritional therapist. He's really passionate about healing chronic fatigue, obesity, and depression epidemics after solving his own similar issues. His Evan Brand podcast has over 7 million downloads and counting, which is awesome. He's the author of Stress Solutions, REM Rehab, and the Everything Guide to Nootropics. He offers free 15-minute functional medicine consultations at his website, evanbrand.com. Welcome to the show, Evan.
Krista, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about kind of the emotional side of functional nutrition, functional medicine, all these back-end things, because it's just like we were talking a little bit about how I work on skin issues before. We sort of view things as an external problem or a different kind of problem. We don't always think about the nutritional manifestation or the functional manifestation of emotional issues, right?
Yeah, well, I just had a client last week and she was talking about how she didn't know that detox actually meant emotional detox as well, which was kind of interesting. And so we were primarily just working on her chemical issues that we had found. But what we figured out was that she had a lot of emotional stuff in the bucket, so to speak, too. And so once we got rid of all toxins from a heavy metal chemical perspective, she started having like childhood emotions pop out and all sorts of crazy things. So I think the gut and emotions are highly linked. I believe we're holding emotion in our gut that you can literally detox from.
Yeah. I watched this show with my husband, and that was on the episode this week on This Is Us. She talked about, I really think I held all my emotions in to where it started as a stomach ache, and now it just aches deep down to my bones because I held in all those emotions. And I think that's such a big piece. I will often say this. I don't have a podcast called The Less Stressed Life because I'm some kind of stress expert, but because we manifest stress in different ways. It's not just emotional. It shows up as different areas, but you can't discount the emotional and psychological factors or it's really hard to get better.
Yeah, well, this is part of the reason I have the ACE questionnaire, the Adverse Childhood Experiences questionnaire on my intake form, because I started talking with a friend of mine, Nikki Gratrix. She's a lady who talks a lot about trauma. She'd be a good guest for your podcast too. And she told me about how traumas can affect this and affect that and cortisol rhythm, et cetera. And I thought, well, crap, I'm testing cortisol, I'm testing the gut. Why am I not testing, so to speak, for these issues? So I just started asking people, and it turns out, I would say the vast majority of people I work with, their ACE score, a maximum of 10, that's a very bad traumatic childhood. The average client's about a 5. Almost all of them have a handful of traumatic experiences, whether it was sexual abuse or verbal abuse, physical abuse, being around parents, watching your parents get abused, watching your parents dealing with alcoholism, watching with parents with drug issues, could even be prescription drug issues. It doesn't have to be hard drugs. Could be your mom's on pain pills all the time. So when I see that the score is above 5, I start to get really curious. And then I'll probe these people a bit more and say, hey, what's the most stressful period of your life? That's always a question I ask. Yeah. A lot of times it's now, the current time. That's why they're, finally reaching out for help. But could have been something 20 years ago.
Right. Absolutely. And sometimes you don't even realize, this is where it gets a little challenging when we think we're going into work on medical or nutritional type issues. And then you kind of are being a little bit the counselor. Not that that's our focus, but trying to refer out to the right people. I was talking to a client who is a therapist the other day, and we were discussing fibromyalgia, and she was telling me about how in research it's shown there's like a very, very high association with fibromyalgia later in life and having childhood abuse at some point. And so that makes tons of sense because I definitely see with almost all autoimmunity a huge component of stress as a piece. So yeah, I found that really interesting. I think if we would dig into the research, it's very, very much linked. But this is where it's a challenge with clients sometimes because they come in that they're sometimes emotionally wrecked, and that needs to be handled as well.
Well, that's where a practitioner has to know when to refer out, just because we can get into some really deep stuff with people. And then at a certain point, you're like, well, holy crap, am I actually capable of having this conversation about this person wants to get a divorce? This person, their husband just beat him last week. Like, this is crazy. So,
Right.
yeah, I think a lot of us in this field, we want to help as many people as we possibly can. But at a certain point, you got to know when you got to get somebody else on board on the team.
Absolutely. That is a huge piece. But from that perspective, if we think about it, sometimes these underlying nutritional or gut or whatever issues can be causing the emotional, or it's starting to manifest as this emotional piece. For example, Evan, if you see kids, we were just talking about seeing kids. For example, what are some common signs and symptoms you see from kids that have an underlying pathogen or some component?
Yeah, it's the behavior, number one. So it could be issues that the teacher is expressing to the parents. So it could be they can't sit still, they're fidgeting. It could be something related to minerals or adrenals, but a lot of times it's the gut. It could be signs on the fingernails of kids, the vertical ridging on the fingernails. If you see ridges on the nails, you see little white spots or other issues on the fingernails, that could be some underlying issue of malabsorption. It could be mood, so it could be irritability, could be anger, could be outburst, it could be depression. I've had moms bring their 5 or 10-year-old kids to me and I've had many moms say, yeah, my 9-year-old says, I want to die, or I don't want to live anymore, or, you've got suicidal kids that are not even teenagers yet. So it's quite scary, but the good news is you can figure out where this stuff is coming from, and usually it's the gut.
Yeah, and at least the parents are looking for help. I think that's a huge testament to how some awesome parents out there that are really looking for help and not just ignoring it, right? That's the worst thing we can do is ignore the problem because they don't get better on their own.
That's right. Well, and it's not a deficiency of pharmaceutical drugs either, because the conventional approach, we always have to bring this up, is that it's going to be some type of Ritalin. If it's an ADD or ADHD issue, it's potentially like an Adderall or a Vyvanse or some other type of methamphetamine derivative. So, these are the prescriptions that are getting written on a daily basis. And when it comes to children, we know antibiotics are very heavily used and overused, and the parents don't make the connection between the food sensitivity or the food allergy and, say, ear infection. And so then the kid goes and gets tubes in their ears, which has been shown not to be very effective after all. And the parent was never told about the link between the nutritional piece and what's going on with the kid. Also, other symptoms of kids, it's usually the stuff with the bowels. So it could be diarrhea or constipation, or maybe the bowels alternate. Skin issues are huge. So eczema, psoriasis, dermatitis type issues. Thrush on the tongue, very common, very easy to see and spot. Also cradle cap, but cradle cap could happen. I just call it cradle cap, but it could happen for older children as well. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, you could see kids that have kind of a yellowy, flaky, scaly type skin under their hair, right against the scalp. And that's usually candida. Mm-hmm. But we know candida is rare to see by itself. So if we find candida, usually it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's probably something else going on.
Right, absolutely. And the thing is, we start to get really complacent because we're like, oh, everyone's got cradle cap, right? But really, every little thing is just a picture. If we really were aware of listening to our body and seeing some of those different things. You mentioned, I can't help but share something that was really ailing me this morning. I have this 13-year-old girl who was on ADHD medication before she came to me, and we did really well with her skin. Her skin's looking really beautiful. She's had this for her whole life. And then now suddenly last week, after her skin cleared, everything looks good, her hair started all falling out, like really overwhelmed. I mean, you can't push at all these. This is a big deal, right? Like to lose your hair is a really big deal, especially as a woman or a girl as a teenager. So very distressing. And so we looked at what happened 3 to 4 months ago, because hair loss is going to be latent about 3 to 4 months after a big thing. Was there a surgery? Was there a medication change? Whatever. And mom finally decided that the ADHD medication was changed about 3 to 4 months ago, which was before we started working together. And so it's almost really dead on. And if you look up some of the research about it, there was some very similar cases where this happened. So this poor girl is losing this. And it just really, it breaks my heart, because we're pretty medicated. We put our trust in people that we believe are going to help our children, and no one's at fault here, right? But it's like, gosh, there's so much more we could be doing, right, than be giving medications that have side effects that are so detrimental to kind of like our overall emotional health.
Yeah, I'm not a fan. I mean, I've had some people, unfortunately, where they'll say, hey, between now and last time we talked, my kid got an ear infection and his ear was hurting and it was on the weekend, so I knew you might not respond via email, so we went to the urgent care and they pumped him full of antibiotics. It's like, oh, crap. Because now we know when we get that test back, again, the retest, we're probably going to see there's more candida, potentially more bacteria going on. So it's not a good situation out there in the mainstream world. And you and I were kind of chatting off air about kids, and it's like, look, I wasn't trained necessarily as a pediatric functional medicine practitioner. I just had to evolve into that because I was seeing these pediatricians that call themselves integrative or pediatric, or they call them functional or holistic or whatever. But then they still prescribe antibiotics, and it's like, well, what the heck? That's not functional. That's not natural. That's not holistic. So I've just had to, I guess, shine my light out there, be a beacon, and say, look, there is another way.
Yeah, there is a real lack of pediatric functional, and it's just it's kind of like with anything. It feels like this scary or uncharted territory, or people don't want to touch it, and so there's just fewer practitioners in it.
Good point. I think the fear is a huge aspect, and people they do the CYA policy, cover your ass. And so nobody wants to go and use an herb with a kid because people are going to say, well, herbs haven't been studied on kids. And then there's this gray area where you don't know, is something safe? Is okay? And the kid's how old? And people, yeah, they get scared. So then they just do nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Doing nothing isn't really an answer. So, and we could go on about that, but let's talk about your history, Evan, because this is really how you got over to this end of the pond. It sounds like. Tell me about your background.
Yeah. So my story is more my own suffering, which is most of us that did this by necessity, not really by choice. I dealt with anxiety issues and depression issues as a teenager, and developed gut issues that went into college, and developed skin issues, and went to the conventional doctors, got prescription pad written for antibiotics and antispasmodic drugs and other prescriptions that I can never remember. It was maybe 3 or 4 different prescriptions, and I just denied them all and left and said, well, I've got to figure this thing out. And that was about 10 years ago. And so once I knew the conventional medicine wasn't going to help me, I had to figure out, well, what the heck else is out there? I didn't know that the term would be functional. I didn't care what the term was or, what letters after the name that people had. I just cared, okay, who has answers? So just started doing the food as medicine thing. Went on a paleo template, got maybe 80% better, realized that wasn't good enough, started getting into functional medicine. I honestly don't know how I ended up from there to there. I was in the trenches, and then you come across stuff, right? When you're desperate, you're looking for answers. And so then I found out, hey, there could be some stuff going on in my gut. I had a buddy of mine suggest I had parasites, so I ran a stool test, confirmed I did have parasites. I had Giardia and Cryptosporidium, which are 2 waterborne parasites. I also had an H. pylori infection, massive candida overgrowth. My gut was super inflamed. My gut was super leaky. So I had to go and approach these things using herbs. We know the conventional treatment for H. pylori is what's called triple therapy or a quadruple therapy, which is 3 or 4 antibiotics at the same time. Has an abysmal success rate, by the way. I didn't want to do that, so I did herbs instead. Luckily, cleared out all the bugs. And now I'm way better. I'm better than I've ever been. Now, I'm not done. I'm not out of the woods. I don't think we're ever out of the woods. The modern world is so toxic and stressful. We just have to always be working on ourselves, in my opinion. But I'll tell you, if I knew that I would end up where I am today, I wouldn't have believed it, just because I always kind of joke about, it's not really a joke, it's not funny, but this was my realities. When I was in college, I would go into a new hall or a new room, and I have to figure out, where's the bathroom in this building, because I may have to go run and poop. And that was probably the Giardia or the crypto. I mean, all these parasites and pathogens can cause loose stool. It could cause constipation. A lot of people end up constipated with gut bugs, but in my case, it was the other. And now I'm good. I mean, it's great to be able to sit somewhere and be able to know, hey, I can hang out at this place for a few hours and not have to think about pooping. That's a great feeling, and that's priceless. People don't understand.
Mm-hmm. And, the other thing is, did you kind of do a history, or did you really did you think a lot about where these things came from after you found them? Have you thought a lot about that and kind of where we're picking these up in our environment?
I did. I thought some of it was a result of swimming in Barton Springs. I used to live in Austin, Texas for a couple of years, and it's a spring. It's a natural spring. I grew up swimming and being out on the water with my dad, going fishing, riding boats, riding jet skis, etc. I mean, I was in the lake or the river or a creek, a stream. I mean, I was an outdoor kid. I was, not literally, but I was locked outside. Go play. I mean, I'm very fortunate that I was outside as much as I was as a kid. Now kids are so deficient in nature. You've got people writing books on that now. They call it nature deficit disorder. Luckily, the nature is so good for your health, but it has the downside that running around barefoot and swimming in lakes and creeks exposes you to these pathogens, which is where most of them originate from. So Cyclospora is another common parasite we see. We see Dentamoeba fragilis, we see Blastocystis hominis, we see the Giardia, the crypto. All these guys could potentially come from water. Now, there's others in the soil. There's some that could be in the air, the water supply, even your tap water supply for not drinking a high-quality filtered water or cooking with a high-quality water. Think about it. What do they use to make rice? They use water. So you go to a restaurant and you get rice. Well, what kind of water do you think they use for that rice? Well, of course, it's tap water. So you could get something in the food very easily that's a, quote, waterborne parasite. And you're like, well, I didn't swim in a lake. Well, did you eat rice? It could be something that simple. And some people like to argue we can coexist with parasites. I just don't. I see the inflammation. I see the gut barrier function. We see the nutrient and malabsorption indicators. We see the symptoms, depression, anxiety, fatigue, weight gain, etc. And so I don't believe that you should leave these things alone. If I find them on a test, I'm going to take care of them.
I bookmarked a page recently. I read a book about nothing to do with medicine, but I was really someone taking a motorcycle trip from the U.S. down to the southern tip of South America. And there was a really excellent page I was going to scan and put in my program. And it really talked about them, they had some anti-parasitic things on hand. I don't know what they all had with them on their trip. But basically, she would talk about, oh, my boyfriend was sick that night, so he went to bed and blah, blah, blah. We didn't know if we wanted to use this medication. And she talked about a friend from South America who said, she told her friend, I think it's gross that you automatically do these medications to get rid of parasites. And her friend said, I think it's gross that you don't. And so I thought that was just really interesting. That was a really interesting paragraph in the book that had nothing to do with health. And it was just modern day. It was written, about a trip that was taken a few years ago. I think that the tricky thing that makes this a complicated conversation is that my understanding is in the United States, we used to look at parasites more readily, right? Like maybe even as late as the 80s. But now it's almost like unless you went to a foreign country or something like that, it's like it's not even a concern. I wonder what the shift was. What do you think?
Oh, I think it's just the pharmaceutical industry is not making as much money on anti-parasitic drugs. And so we know just by talking with many friends of mine that are doctors that are in the conventional field and were trained conventionally as medical doctors, they'll tell you straight up that they'll have a webinar or a seminar sponsored by Pfizer. So if there's not a pharmaceutical interest in it, why pursue that? Why go down the rabbit hole? Why spend time educating or re-educating or giving the latest data on parasite statistics if you're only going to make $10 on a bottle of, metronidazole or mebendazole or some of these other commonly prescribed drugs? That's probably number one. You just have to follow the money trail. Probably other causes, but that's my first guess.
Yeah. And we want to think that we're clean and we're not affected by this, but we're just as affected. I always think like, okay, so we eat sushi and now we're into like raw things. I mean, nowadays, after you look at so many gut tests, you're like, yeah, I don't think I'm comfortable with with the claims that your fish is clean enough to eat raw. I'm just not sure.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah, the raw fish, people are doing raw butter, they're doing raw milk, they're doing raw cheeses. Everything's going raw, like, pasteurization is the devil now. So there are some enzymes and things that do get killed in pasteurization. So I'm not saying you should eat pasteurized. I'm not saying you shouldn't eat unpasteurized. I'm just saying when you're doing a workup on somebody, you've got to consider what all's coming down the hatch. And so for me, this is why a lot of times we pull dairy out of the picture, at least temporarily, just to help rule in or rule things out. Now, butter generally is okay, but a lot of the cheeses and yogurts and stuff like that, generally we pull those out, at least for a period of time until we can get things settled down.
I always say it's kind of like Russian roulette because for multiple reasons, unless you're milking the cow, you don't know what the scoop is. And the second thing is that I think some of my clients get lost in is whenever I reintroduce dairy, I ask them to start with grass-fed versus just regular. And people definitely see the difference. I saw the difference in my own health. I was getting more itchy from regular dairy. And I've got this other IBD client. He says, he gets gas when it's regular dairy, but he does just fine with grass-fed cheese. But recently I had and that's really fun to be able to pinpoint that because you've been really strategic about everything to the point where you're like, yeah, I see the difference. This is cool. And so you're able to see kind of how you feel differently. But I recently had a case I was telling you about where, I say when you reintroduce this, start with grass-fed butter and cheese. So mom took that and went and bought grass-fed raw cheese, and her son started having blood in the stool right away. And I'm like, okay, not raw, just grass-fed. This is kind of a red flag when this happens. Maybe that's not going to work very well for you.
Right. What happened after that? Did you figure out it was that or?
Yeah, so we stopped the cheese and the blood stopped, and then we turned up our gut improvement or anti-inflammatory options and, said, please don't do that. If you're going to reintroduce, do grass-fed butter, if anything. But this mom was really into her dairy. She was a raw milk person beforehand. And so it's kind of hard when you see all these things. But just like you had just said, once you start seeing the kind of mess that lies beneath, you're like, yep, not worth the effort on this. So I agree.
Tastes good. That's about as far as I'll go with it. I'm not putting it in at this time with myself. I've worked so hard that to me it's kind of a step back.
Right. Yeah. Right before air, we were also talking about the prevalence. So just talking about through history in the U.S., especially, and talking about overall parasites, I think something I became kind of passionate about this year because my daughter experienced this was pinworms. And this is really kind of frustrating to me that this isn't part, now because we don't have a choice, like lice prevention and lice discussion has become really that's becoming kind of normal to talk about in schools. Kids, we're being really preventative. The schools that are most preventative do the best job. But why don't we talk about pinworms a little bit? Because they're so common. When I found these on my child, who by the way had those same behavioral issues you mentioned earlier, and I knew there was a problem, but sometimes it's hard to get the people around you to believe the things that you know are true. I was surprised and appalled that on the CDC's website it says, and I paraphrase directly from them, that if you have children, you work with children, or you work in an institutionalized setting, your prevalence rate your prevalence of a potential pinworm infection is 50%. Now, how come no one wants to talk about that?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, parasites are huge. My daughter had them. I would suspect a lot of kids have them. And that's the itchy bum, too. Kids may complain that their butt itches, could be pinworms. Very, very common. Mm-hmm. Why don't they want to talk about it? I've got no clue. Yeah. I don't have a good answer for that one. I would just say that I do see it often, and it's more difficult than you think to get rid of it. You got to really work hard on the bed sheets and everything. I mean, those little eggs can get under fingernails and all sorts of little sneaky places. Right.
So let's talk about common parasites seen in the United States and beyond and how you figure that out, because it's not witch doctor stuff. We have some easy to use parasite testing options. So tell us about things that you see and the method of how that is tested for.
Yeah, so we use a DNA connections is Lyme. I had DNA in my brain. DNA GI map panel from a company called Diagnostic Solutions. That's what I use currently. So if you're listening in the future, maybe I switched, but for now that's been the best one. I've run over 2,000 of these tests. And I mentioned some of the parasites already: the crypto, sporidium, giardia, blasto, Dentamoeba fragilis, cyclospora. Those are kind of the big ones that we see. There's others on there too, but those are kind of the top go-to ones that we see. Bacterial pathogens, we test for those as well. Gut inflammation, we look at that. H. pylori is huge. My daughter just showed up with H. pylori on her stool test, so got to get rid of it. And what was the other part of the question? The one part was, how do we find them? What are the common ones? Was there another part to that question?
Oh, yeah. No, it was just like, is it a stool test? Because I think sometimes people don't realize that a stool test is how we're most commonly testing for it. Yep.
Yeah, and this is an at-home stool test, which is great because we can work around the world with people. And I've had clients as far as South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and we can send the test kits over there and get that back to the States. And so there's no doctor required, and you don't have to go beg a doctor who doesn't want to explore new things with you. You know, so many people are like, oh, my doctor doesn't want to run this. It's like, okay, well, that's what we're here for. We're not doctors, but we're able to get this testing done that, you know, frankly, doctors just don't have a clue about. They're using an outdated technology. Sometimes it's human microscopy, or sometimes it's antigen-based testing, which is far more inaccurate. So I need to bring up an important point here, which is that if you go to your kid's doc and they refer you to a gastro doc, or for adults listening as well, if you go to your gastro doc, they're going to run a very outdated and highly inaccurate test on you. They may run some breath testing, they may do stool, they may do urine, but their technology is not the same as what we're using. We're on the bleeding edge here. And so it may be another 10 or 20 years before we see these type of technologies being used widespread. So long story short, if you get an all clear message from your GI doc, but you still have symptoms, then you need to pursue further, because I doubt that test was accurate and you probably have infections, because I see it every single day. I see all these workups people have had done and it got missed. And then we run our testing, and guess what? Now we find XYZ bug, and then we know why this person has suffered for so long.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In fact, I saw a famous functional medicine practitioner not too many years ago, and he did some of this poor testing. And so one of the things he told me was that I could do nothing. I'm like, wow, I cannot believe that is what you were telling me. But it was really important. It was an important experience because it allowed me to not do the same thing. And so I couldn't agree more with that. I think that's something that is accidentally missed. We automatically think that all these tests are going to be the same, but it takes practice and research to know which ones are the best. And, you know, when your provider is in a place where he's only got access to one, that is a bit of a, inhibition, or a bit of a barrier, I guess. So that's a really, really good point. And, you know, I don't know about you, but I find some of, something that's a little tricky. You know, I like to do stool testing on someone who's got a digestive issue, on someone who's had problems for more than 10 years. I always tell them, like, hey, you're going to want to do this. Anyone who's got an autoimmune factor or an autoimmune issue. But I find that people who don't necessarily have a diagnosed condition are some of the worst ones, right? So you might not really believe that you've got much for digestive issues, but let's say you're pretty fatigued and you just don't really feel great at all. You feel just kind of not great, but you don't have all these diagnoses that some people do. Those tests still look like crap, right? Wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah. I would say my I guess qualifications for running a stool test is if you poop, and that should be everyone because you're a human. So, you know, because I've seen now, people may say, well, I'm biased because I'm working with people that are not well, right? These people are not the 1% top of health. They feel amazing. Everything's perfect. Some of those people still choose to work with me, and you'd be surprised, some of these top athletes that I've worked with, that they still have infections, and then we clear those and they get even better performance, even better energy, better sleep, etc. So people may say I'm biased in the sense that the people that come to me have symptoms, therefore there may be more higher prevalence of infection. But look at your average person. I mean, the obesity rate is astronomical. We've got more obese people than overweight people now. So overweight, you know, that's when your BMI is up some. And then you've got obese, which is your BMI is really high, you know, 40, 50, 60, 100 pounds overweight. There's more obese than there are overweight people. If you look at some of the CDC's statistics they just put out this year on obesity, I mean, it's absolutely insane. So those people probably have just as many gut bugs, causing just as much inflammation, causing just as many autoimmune conditions as the people who have done all the low-hanging fruit. They've dialed in the diet, they've listened to the podcast, they've done the supplements, etc., and then they still have problems. Those people are probably not that much different when you get to the piece of paper.
Yeah, that is very true. So let's talk about, go back to not just your story, but overall, if someone comes in and they have parasites, right, which is very likely, what are some of the few points that you have them consider when trying to make sure that they're not going to get reinfected? Because that's a thing as well. So you're having them looking at water, maybe I heard you say before, or you're having them look at pets. Like, could you walk us through how you want them to look at their environment to make sure that we're not just reinfecting?
Well, their partner is the first place to start. Now, we can't say with 100% certainty that all partners are going to reinfect their partner, but I would say based on the thousands of tests I've run, I would say about 90% of the time we're seeing that the partner, whether this is just kissing or sharing cups or spoons, sharing a fork. This could even be with your children. A lot of times the parents are actually the vector, passing the bug on to the children. Hey, honey, try this bite of this. Here's my fork. And then you pass the H. pylori through saliva and you infect your children. And so we have to test the parents if we're working with kids. If we're testing the wife or the mom, then we also test the husband or the dad. And a lot of times the guys, I don't know what their problem is, but they're reluctant and they're skeptics and they're stubborn and they don't want to do it. And I say, look, don't be selfish. If you don't care about yourself, that's fine. But if you're going to spend this money, make sure you test yourself, because you're going to reinfect your wife, and then your wife spent all this time and money and suffering, and now she can't get better because you reinfected her. And this happens the other way too. But I would just say vast majority of the time it's the guys that are stubborn. But I did have one male client who he was in his 50s. We cleared out the H. pylori. His issue was chronic pain in his abdominal area, which that's H. pylori a lot of times, especially if you're hungry, and that pain worsens when you're hungry. A lot of times that's H. pylori. And we cleared him out. He felt great. And then 3 months later, he emailed me, Evan, I've gone backwards. I was like, did you ever test your wife? Nope, she doesn't want to get tested. I'm like, well, I don't know what to say. I said, we can do another round of antimicrobials, but you're going to waste your money. Maybe you can feel great again for 3 months, which is fine, and then you can go backwards, whatever you want to do. Finally, guess what? She bites the bullet. She gets her stool test. There it is. Boom, H. pylori. And so now what did we do? We did a protocol for both of them, and then now he's better, and I haven't heard from him until our next appointment, which is in like a year, because he's doing so good now. And, his wife was the roadblock. So sometimes you've got to look outside of yourself. Sometimes you're not the problem anymore, and you got to look elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm sure some people will bookmark this spot on the podcast and then send the little snippet to their husband probably. So you're looking at partner. Where else do you look at when you want to make sure someone's not getting reinfected?
The pinworm issue, as I mentioned earlier, you've got to change sheets. You've got to wash stuff in hot water. You've got to clean doorknobs. You've got to clean door handles. You've got to go nuts. There's a product called Beneffect, I believe is the name. It's like a natural, clinically proven blend. I want to say it's thyme oil, maybe clove. Either way, they have wipes, Beneffect wipes, and the Beneffect's liquid. It kills like 99% of all sorts of different bad bacteria versus using like Lysol or some other conventional chemical, right? You got all these people being diagnosed with COPD now that have never smoked, and it's because they're using all these terrible personal care products and terrible inhalants like let's say your Lysol, your 409, your Fantastic, all those name brand cleaners. Those are just toxic. So if you're, quote, detoxing or cleaning your house, make sure you're using legit, clean, safe, healthy products. You can look up the environmental working group and research your products to make sure they're clean. So some of it is like a house detox in that sense of sheets and door handles and doorknobs. You mentioned the pets, so that's a good one too, because a lot of times, let's say you have a dog with a Giardia infection, very common, right? Because the dog runs outside. Giardia is a common parasite found in creeks and streams. The dog could go outside and drink up a puddle, gets Giardia, gets infected. That could be passed via saliva. Your kid goes and grabs the disgustingly slobbery dog toy and throws it, and then the kid picks his nose or eats his boogers or puts his fingers in his mouth, and guess what? Now the kid's got Giardia. So the pets could be another potential vector. And the good news is you can get rid of parasites in pets the same way you can with adults and children, which is by using natural antiparasitic herbs. So it could be the pet and water. So got to make sure you've got good, clean water for cooking, drinking, bathing. I have a whole house filter. I also have a reverse osmosis system, and I have a Berkey, which is a stainless steel countertop system. It works great. So water, you'll spend a little money to have good quality water. But if you're just depending on something like your fridge filter or a Brita, those are garbage. Throw them away. It's not even worth it. Brita maybe or the Pure, the PUR brand that you attach to your sink, maybe reduces a little bit of lead, maybe a little bit of chlorine or chloramine. That's about it. In terms of cyst, giardia, cryptosporidium, etc., you need a really, really high quality filter. You're not going to be able to filter out gasoline and all these other crazy stuff. Pharmaceutical drugs, for example, we've got antidepressant drugs, we've got cardiac drugs, we've got anti-anxiety, benzodiazepine medications in the water supply. So I could go on an hour rant if you wanted me to about why you have to filter your drinking and cooking water. I don't even travel without bringing my water with me. I'll just bring a big stainless steel container of filtered water. If I'm out and about really far away from the house, of course, I can buy something. But if I'm just traveling locally, I've always got my own water. I avoid tap water like it's the plague. Now, that sounds like snobby, right? So people are like, oh my God, this guy, he's a water Nazi. Look, I'm super grateful that we have potable water, something that we can turn a faucet on and drink it, and it looks relatively clean and relatively clear. I'm super grateful. Don't get me wrong. My gratitude level is 1,000 to be able to have good looking clean water. However, we know based on the EPA studies of thousands of different cities and tap water supplies, the water is contaminated. So, in the third world and second world, developing world, there's issues over there with water. We've got issues over here with water too. It just manifests differently.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I mean, I'm with you because water was a big piece of my own health journey. It kind of, the wrong kind of water sent me over the edge actually. And we don't.
What kind of water?
Well, I was at a swimming pool too many days in a row. And so the chlorine really just taxed me to the max. And I had many clues before that. And then it all really, when you really assemble your own puzzle, you're like, yep, I just don't do well with chlorine at all.
That's a lot with kids too. A lot of kids with these behavioral issues, they have like swimming club memberships, and especially when the weather's bad, these kids are going to indoor pools. And those places, look at lifeguards who work at indoor pools. Most of them are overweight due to the chlorine blocking the iodine receptor site, therefore causing hypothyroidism. And we can measure this via blood. Look at the lifeguards working at a saltwater pool in comparison. You're going to see less obesity. Now, of course, that is a very big statement for just one potential bad guy. Of course, they could have a bad diet and infections and all sorts of stuff, but the chlorine aspect is huge. And so what we do for kids, swimming is good for you, right? It's fun, it's relaxing, it's great. But what we do is we just give some kids some of the micronized chlorella, just a few drops before and after swimming, and that mitigates the risk.
Yeah. Along that same line, if we think about it, I think we just really discount water because we discount it, right? We take it for granted, right? Because we have clean water, thank God. But because we take it for granted, we don't think about what a big piece of our lives it is. And so we're bathing in it, we're drinking it. It's the majority of our drinking, I hope. So it is a big, big piece. And it's hard to find like the perfect, I've had people, I've tried to send them to get water tested because it is really nice to understand where am I getting this problem, because I don't want to keep having that problem. But sometimes it's like, well, let's just get some good filters in place and other things. So those are good points. So just to recap, it was evaluating the people you live with. And, there are studies that show that we share a microbiome with the people that we live with, right? One study in particular looked at the microbiome of all the people in the house, whether they were intimate or not intimate. And the one person was on antibiotics. And for the 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks, I don't remember how long the study was following, everyone in the house's microbiome was impacted. So partners,
Whoa.
Big deal. Yeah. So, and then we've got pets. We care about that. The other thing is we always treat our pets better than ourselves sometimes. I think a lot of people do give their pets antiparasitics, but I have seen or heard some stories from other mentors talking about someone that did not get over H. pylori, treat the dog. Now we're over H. pylori.
Ah, wow. So here's the funny thing, right? Like it's so common and normal when you go into the vet when your dog's sick. What kind of food are they eating? When's the last time you went to your doctor and they said, okay, what's your diet? Never.
Sure.
That's the first question a vet asks most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot we could discuss about veterinary. The difference between veterinary and human medicine. I should almost have a veterinarian come on. Actually,
you should.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we talked water, partners, pets, all the people we're living with, and did I miss one? I feel like I missed one, Nevin.
Soil, like going barefoot in the soil. Totally beneficial and healthful, but there's a lot of bugs, a lot of bacteria in the soil. Some good guys, some bad guys, and so if your kid's like eating dirt, obviously you could get exposed to some pathogens that way too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another thing to mention about the chlorine, you were talking about iodine, but just from a big picture standpoint, chlorine is bleach, so it's antimicrobial. So if we're automatically kind of drinking a low grade antimicrobial all the time, it's going to impact our microbiome. And we know that our microbiome can impact things like ghrelin and leptin, the hunger and satiety hormones, right? And so all of those can have a big picture impact. And I think the challenge is that, especially in research, is that sometimes we look at everything like they're the same, but we know each person is individual and they all have their own immune system status. They all have their own personal genetics. And so some of us are affected more by certain things than other people are, right?
You make a really good point about the chlorine. I was talking just about bathing in chlorine, which could be a bad thing for your skin microbiome because it's sort of like a topical antimicrobial, right? You're killing off these good bacteria on your skin. And so you could have issues just from that perspective, but also the drinking of the chlorine. Also, fluoride is commonly added. Like in Kentucky where I am, fluoride is added to the water supply, not good for thyroid, and causes dental fluorosis. It can cause issues with the teeth as well. And so you've got to make sure you filter out chlorine for bathing as well as drinking in your home. And there's a study on this that the Canadians have done. If you just type in trihalomethanes cancer, you can read a Canadian study that estimates 30% of all cancers are caused from trihalomethane exposure via a hot shower. And the hotter the shower you take, the more trihalomethanes, which are the byproducts of the disinfectant chemicals used to kill, hopefully, pathogens like parasites in the tap water supply. Those byproducts of disinfecting remain in the water, and when you heat that up, those disinfectant products become airborne. You breathe it into your lungs, negatively affecting your lung tissue, as well as creating cancer risk. And so this is a big deal. This is why everyone should have a shower filter. And if you don't, now's the time to get one.
Yeah, big deal. I haven't read that study. I'll go look for it. So let's wrap by talking about kind of your personal story and maybe some other things that you've seen in clients from dealing with parasites, because we were talking about the mental, emotional component in depression. So tell us, give us a little bit of a timeline on how that just reversed. Like, how did you see that start to reverse as you treated yourself or maybe in some of your clients?
Yeah, so for me, it was a gradual thing. Like the food is medicine thing got me maybe 80% better, right? So the gradual reduction of the other 20% of issues took longer, but the initial 80% just with diet alone was very awesome. For most clients, I tell people 5 to 10% improvement each month, and a lot of times we beat that. So I did a podcast that should be coming out real soon. I've already had it recorded with a woman named Rebecca, and we speak about her daughter who was 9 years old and who had psoriasis, full body rashes all over, and was going to be in a wedding. And the little girl was too embarrassed when she went to go try on dresses. She was just humiliated. She felt so ugly and she didn't want to be part of the wedding anymore, so just really affected her social confidence. And mom gave me a pretty strict timeline. She's like, look, the wedding is this day. I want her to be better by then. I'm like, oh my God, you're putting me under the gun here. So we worked as fast as we could. We investigated her gut. We did find several infections in the gut, and we kind of talk about the lab results on the podcast. I don't have her file up right now, so I can't remember exactly what was going on, but it was a handful of bad guys, and we cleared up the diet. We cleared up the gut, and within 6 weeks to maybe 8 weeks on the long end, she was like 95% better with her skin. And the mom was like, you couldn't even tell anything was ever wrong with the skin. And that almost brought tears to my eyes when I got to hear the progress. It was just so exciting. She said she went to the wedding. She was in the dress. She looked so beautiful. We've got all these great professional pictures now where she's just so happy. It's like at the end of the day, that's why we do this. We're not just doing it for the piece of paper. Obviously, it's great to see the piece of paper, right? The bad guy goes away. But really, we're wanting to see that we're putting these kids back in society so that they can be better teachers, so they can be better students, so that we can be better parents. We can be a better wife, a better husband, a better partner, a better granddaughter or a better grandfather. We want to be good, productive members of society. We look at the healthcare cost that we have. It's astronomical. It's so many missed days of work, so many medical appointments, so much radiation, so much antibiotics. We're on this carousel right now, and we want to get off of it. And that's kind of my goal at the end of the day, is to get people off the carousel. It's kind of a bittersweet moment when you get a client to the point where you go through the list of symptoms to kind of check in, and the list is gone. And you're like, well, I guess you don't need me anymore. Talk to you next year for a follow-up. Like that's almost kind of sad. It's like, man, when you move the needle so much, it gets so fun and it's addicting as a practitioner that once you resolve everything, it's like, oh man, I wanted you to have something else to complain about so we can fix it, you know? But hey, look, you want to teach people how to fish, right? You want to get them off that carousel ride.
Yeah, actually, it's funny that you say that because I'll always do an initial intake to see if we're a good fit. And I always say to people, like, I like when you have a lot of problems because that's a lot of, it's so fun to fix everything. It's fun for us to have so many things to fix.
I get excited when I see H. pylori pop up on a stool test. I'm like, yes, H. pylori. Because now I know, hey, look, Miss Jane, your fatigue, your abdominal pain, your bloating, your heartburn, your digestive complaints, your constipation alternating with diarrhea, your skin issues, your depression, anxiety. Did I mention those already? Look, I have an answer for almost all of these now for potentially where this could be coming from. So to be able to see the answer and have the golden key, it's a very great, empowering feeling, which is what just makes this so fun.
Yeah, it is really fun. And I'm glad we had the conversation because you said something that I thought was kind of important. People come to me a lot of times for food. And that's what really got me started on the addiction was like massively helping people not do just a generic thing, but kind of a customized protocol that really helps them. But then sometimes you can get to a plateau to a certain point because you do have to address these other infections or pathogens or other stressors, and that's why this is a less stressed life, right? So you come looking for diet. And so for me, sometimes it's talking to them. Sometimes it's the first time that they've heard that, gosh, there could be another piece, dear. Like there's a reason that you're not getting more tolerance to foods. You should not be on this restricted diet forever to the point of you feel like you can't be normal, right?
Amen.
You should be able to enjoy things, make it feel normal, etc. And so that's where it really went down this path. And then once you see all these stool tests, you're like, yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. Everyone does need this, but sometimes it's a matter of let me help you understand why you need this, even if you don't have digestive symptoms, because if you are fatigued and have these other things, you don't want to be having an underlying problem that even though you're so much better with food, causes you to relapse later because you didn't address all the pieces. And so that's kind of a big, it's a big kind of a soapbox that I have kind of routinely. So I'm glad we're having this conversation publicly because I often have it behind the phone or behind the computer. Like, hey, I don't want you to have a relapse. I want you to feel your best ongoing so you don't need me, or so you don't need really anyone. So you feel like you own this. You are your best self.
Yeah, if people are going for like chocolate to make themselves feel better, like in the middle of the day, if you're tired and you feel like crap and you go sneak and eat a piece of dark chocolate, or maybe it's regular garbage milk chocolate that's got high fructose corn syrup, which is coming from genetically modified corn, which has glyphosate, which is damaging your mitochondria and causing further fatigue. Maybe you're doing that, maybe not. Either way, you probably have issues with your endorphins. And so this is a common whole nother can of worms that I won't open at the end, but I'm kind of opening. So I'll just finish my thought, which is a lot of people lack the endorphins. So this includes your norepinephrine, your epinephrine, your whole family of catecholamines, which also includes dopamine. And we try to self-treat and not address the root cause. So we may go for a piece of dark chocolate to comfort or numb us or to get us through the day, give us a boost of energy. Vegans and vegetarians, I'm specifically calling you out because you're not getting methionine and a lot of the complete aminos you need from avoiding animal proteins. So when you avoid animal proteins, I just did a whole podcast on this that'll be up on my show about metabolism. And this is why we see so many tired and overweight vegetarians is because there's a process in the body called the carnitine shuttle, which takes free-form fatty acids and turns them through a dial, what you could call it. You've got the citric acid cycle and the Krebs cycle in the body. This is a way you manufacture energy. If you're lacking in dietary carnitine, methionine, other amino acids, because you don't have animal protein in the picture, you're going to be more tired. And that's why you talk to a vegetarian and vegan, ask them what one of their favorite foods are. Guess what they're going to tell you? They're going to tell you it's dark chocolate. And that's because they're trying to self-treat. And so the food as medicine stuff is great. It's like, oh, it's organic. It's stone ground. It's, hand-picked by a monk in the Himalayan mountains chocolate. It's like, okay, still chocolate, still trying to self-treat. You're not addressing the root cause, which is you don't have enough endorphins. And we got to fix that. So when you talk with these clients, part of it is the compliance piece that becomes difficult if they don't have enough reasons. This is why, we run the testing to show, hey, here's where the issue is coming from. And then you fix it. And then when you can fix the brain chemistry, sometimes you have to start with the brain because you got to get their brain working enough so that they can even stick to your gut protocol, right? So this is when kind of the finesse of the practitioner comes in. This is where it becomes more of an art form rather than like a protocol template, is getting the person to the point that they can do what you're telling them to do. Yeah. So that's a whole, maybe part 2 can be that conversation. But.
Yeah, that's a big piece of kind of how I refined things. I tell people it's not that you weren't doing some of the right things, it's that a lot of people don't finish or don't follow through or don't completely finish something. But on the note of carnitine shuttle, I mean, I think some of my favorite micronutrient tests are, I feel very strongly that vegetarians and vegans can benefit so much from looking at genetics and micronutrients, because you deserve real-time tests. You deserve some real-time data on what's going on, so that way you can make adjustments as needed so you can actually feel your best. And those are some of the more challenging micronutrient deficiencies and profiles, for some of the reasons you mentioned, right? And so I think it's just really important for people to kind of have that check and be able to say, oh, okay, well, here's XYZ reason, well, why maybe I could adjust either via supplement, via food, whatever. So it's empowering for sure.
Yeah, and I'm not saying this without data. I'm saying this with data. So people that are mad at me, I've got the piece of paper to prove. So if you want to have a chat about it, let's have a chat. I'll show you on a piece of paper what happens to vegetarians and vegans. It's not the meat that's the problem. It's your digestive system that's the problem. It's because you feel bad when you eat meat doesn't mean you blame the grass-fed steak. It's likely an issue where age, stress, infection, and inflammation has lowered your ability to secrete stomach acid. When you have reduced stomach acid, for example, H. pylori, it damages your parietal cells. These are the cells in your stomach that secrete HCl, this hydrochloric acid that's necessary not only to break down your food and turn proteins into free-form amino acids, which then manufacture hormones and neurotransmitters. That's extremely important. But also the piece that stomach acid neutralizes pathogens. So if you have H. pylori, you've lowered your stomach acid. Now you're more susceptible. You and your friend could go eat the same sushi. You get infected. They don't, because you had H. pylori lowering stomach acid. Therefore, you didn't give your food the acid bath that it was supposed to have in your tummy. And this food and these bad guys on the food can continue on and make a home in your small intestine or wherever else. And that's why they stay. It's because they didn't get killed. So with supplemental acid and enzymes and fixing the infections at the root cause here, you can prevent yourself. So this is why, people will try to ask, well, why am I this way? And why is this person not? We both had the same food, or we had the same water. We both went to Mexico. He got sick. I didn't. Why? Well, that's part of the answer.
That's exactly the answer. I love it. In fact, it's almost this should give you some reason. I'm almost surprised when people come back if they do a kind of a self-test or like a free self-test of stomach acid. When they come back like seeming like they have enough stomach acid, I'm shocked, just because pretty much everyone I work with would have low stomach acid. So if that helps you understand how big of a problem it is. You also mentioned age, stress, infection, and inflammation. It was almost like a pillar for each one of the worst micronutrient tests I see. So that was really, really funny. Well, hey, Evan, I hope that this was really inspiring for people listening today. I hope they took away several things, and I hope it got them thinking about how infections aren't just this mythical far-off thing, that they are living with us right where we are, and controlling them can help us live our best life.
I never went out of the U.S., and I had all these bugs, so just because you lived in South Dakota for 20 years, or you lived in upstate New York and you had this pristine farm that you grew up on, and you had well water that was tested and there's no chemicals in it, trust me, your well could be contaminated. That was 20 years ago when you tested it or whatever, and you could still have bugs. If you get pineapple and you live in New York and you're eating pineapple in February that came from Costa Rica, you could have bugs. The Food Supplies International. Go look at your organic blueberries in your fridge. Guess where those came from? Probably Chile or some other South American country if you're eating berries in the fall, because they're not growing right now. There's like last week there was snow on the ground where I live here in Kentucky. So that's why bugs are there. It's because the food's international now, even if we aren't.
Yeah. So it's okay to think that this is not abnormal. It is normal. So, well, thanks so much for sharing.
I see it every day.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing your story, Evan, on gut bugs, depression, and some other things. It was enlightening. It was a fun conversation, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much for having me.
One of the best gifts you could give us at the Less Stress Life is your feedback. We are paid in podcast reviews. If you enjoyed this or any other episode, please leave us a review. In the iTunes store or from your podcast app, just search for Less Stress Life as if you're not already subscribed. Click on the banana face image, scroll to the bottom where it shows the text of other reviews, and write a review. While you're there, hey, make sure you hit subscribe. For Android or Stitcher users, you gotta go to the desktop site and search for Less Stress Life, and then scroll down to leave a review. Stitcher doesn't load Apple reviews on their site, so if you want, you can leave a review in both places. Your feedback means a lot to the success of the show. Thanks so much for taking the time to do that. You rock.